Chess, like draughts, is a game for two players. It is played on a board of 64 squares, dark squares and light squares. To win at chess, you must capture your opponent's king. Chess is very like a battle, fought between two armies. Let us now take a closer look at the battlefield. When you sit down to play chess, make sure you have a white square on your right-hand side. Remember, white on your right. If we join the squares that go up and down the board like this, we will have a line of squares. And lines of squares that go up and down the board are called files. Lines of squares that go across the board, like this, are called ranks. Lines of squares that criss-cross the board, like this, are called diagonals. Next, let us look at the armies that will fight at the battle. Each player has an army of 16 pieces. One army is called white and always makes the opening or the first move. The other army is called black. Each army has two rooks, and they are placed here on the board. Each army has two knights, and they stand beside the rooks here. Each army has two bishops, and they stand next to the knights. Now we come to the most powerful piece on the board, the queen. The queen is placed on a square that matches her colour. The white queen is placed on the white square here, and the black queen occupies the black square here. All the pieces on the queen side of the board are named after her. So, we have the queen's rook, the queen's knight, and the queen's bishop. Next, we will position the king. The king is the most important piece on the board, and he stands next to his queen here. All the pieces on the king's side of the board are named after him. So, we have the king's rook, the king's knight, and the king's bishop. Finally, we come to the pawns. Each army has 8 pawns, and they go along a line of squares in front of the pieces we were just introduced to. Can you remember what we call this line of squares? A rank, yes. Both armies are now ready, but before we begin, we will go back and see how each piece moves. We will start with the rooks. As you should know by now, the rooks are placed on these squares at the start of the game. But let us put a white rook in the centre and see how it moves. The rook moves in straight lines along the ranks and files. This, as you might remember, is a rank. This is a file. From the square that the rook is now on, it can move to any square, along this rank here, or here. It could also move to any square along this file here, or here. The rook can only move in one direction in one turn. What happens when another piece gets in the rook's way? Let us first put a piece belonging to the rook's own army in its way. As before, the rook can move along this rank either in this direction or this direction. It can also move along this file here, and it can move to any square here. But it cannot move beyond this point, as its own piece is blocking its way. It cannot capture or jump over its own piece, so it will not be able to move beyond this square. If we put an enemy piece in the rook's way, let us see what happens. The rook can capture that piece. The white player removes the enemy piece while moving onto the square it occupied, like this. Capturing enemy pieces in chess is so important that you should capture as many enemy pieces as possible to put yourself in a strong position to trap the enemy king. The less pieces your enemy has on the board in relation to your army, the weaker he will be. By the way, you don't have to capture an enemy piece. Now for a test on the rook. In this situation, can the white rook capture any piece? If you remember that the white rook moves in straight lines along the ranks and files, the answer should be easy. Yes, the white rook can capture either the knight or the pawn, but not in the same move. If it decides to capture the pawn, it moves along the file like this, removes the pawn from the board, and moves onto the square which the pawn was. Before capturing, always keep in mind that the enemy is watching and ready to pounce. Next we have the knights. If you remember, each army has 2 knights, and at the start of the game, they stand here beside the rooks. The king's knight on the king's side, and the queen's knight on the queen's side. To see how the knight moves, let us put one in the centre of the board. Whenever the knight moves, it must move 2 squares in one direction, and 1 square to the side. Just think of the letter L. The knight can move up the table, down the table, left or right, but it is always by way of that L-shaped move. Let us now look at a knight moving down the table towards its own army. 2 squares in one direction, and a move to this square to complete its L-shaped move, or to this square here. If the knight wants to move up the table towards the enemy position, it must move in the same L-shaped way. 2 squares in one direction, and a choice of squares, either here or here, to complete his move. Movement to the right also follows the L shape. 2 squares in one direction, and a choice of squares, here or here, to complete his move. Movement to the left follows the same L shape. 2 squares in one direction, and a choice of squares, either here or here, to complete the move. What happens if a piece gets in the knight's way like this? The knight wants to move right, but his own rook seems to be blocking his way. The knight in this situation can do what no other piece can do, and that is jump over the piece in its way. 2 squares in one direction, counting the square jumped over as 1, and the usual choice of squares, either here or here, to complete his L-shaped move. The knight can make this manoeuvre over any piece on the board, his own or any enemy piece. The knight can capture an enemy piece like this. 2 squares in one direction, remove the enemy piece and move onto the square to complete the capture. Next we come to the bishops. Each army has 2 bishops and they stand here beside the knights. The bishop on the king's side is called the king's bishop, and on the queen's side, the queen's bishop. Can you remember what we called lines of squares that crisscross the board like this? Diagonals, that's right. Bishops move along diagonals. A bishop on this square can move to any square along this diagonal, or to any square here, or to any square here, or to any square along this diagonal here. What happens if a piece gets in the bishop's way, like this? As the piece in the way belongs to the same army, the bishop will have to stop and can go no further along this diagonal. The bishop, unlike the knight, cannot jump over pieces. If, on the other hand, an enemy piece gets in the bishop's way, the bishop can capture the enemy piece. It does so by moving along the diagonal as before, removing the enemy piece, and moving on to the square on which the enemy piece stood. Now for a quick test. What pieces, if any, can the white bishop capture? If you remember how the bishop moves, it should be easy. The white bishop can capture either the knight along this diagonal or the rook along this diagonal, but not both on the same move. If the bishop decides to capture the rook, it moves along the diagonal like this and captures the rook like this. Now we come to the most powerful piece on the board, the queen. The queen stands next to her king on the square that matches her colour. The white queen stands on the white square and the black queen stands on the black square here. The queen can move in any direction over any amount of squares. So, if she finds herself here in the centre, she will be able to move to any square along this file or this rank. Can you remember what other piece can move like this? The rook, that's right. But the queen can also move to any square along the diagonals, here or here. What other piece can do that? The bishop, that's right. So the queen can make the moves of a rook and a bishop combined. The one thing a queen cannot do is jump over pieces like the knight can. So if one of her own pieces gets in the way, she has to stop. Now for a slightly more difficult test. Here we have a black queen and a white queen. Which piece can each queen capture? If you remember how the queen moves, you will see why the white queen can move along this diagonal and capture the black knight, while the black queen can travel along this rank and capture the white bishop. Because the queen is so valuable, you should always be very careful that you do not leave her open to attack by an enemy piece. Now we come to the most important piece on the board, the king. At the start of the game, he stands next to his queen here. You must always be extremely careful how you move your king, because if an enemy piece can put itself in a position to capture your king and the king cannot escape, then you lose the game. If you trap the enemy king and he cannot escape, you win. Let us put a white king in the centre of the board and see how he moves. The king can move and capture pieces in any direction, but it can only move one square in any one turn. If a king is in a position where it can be captured on the next move, it is said to be in check. The piece attacking it is called the checking piece. Study the board and see if you can spot the black checking piece attacking the white king. Just think how each piece moves. Yes, it is the rook, because the rook can move along the file here and capture the king. The king is therefore in check. Let us now look at how a king may be able to save himself from capture. A black king is being attacked by a white queen along this file, but the king has a rook and a queen from his own army with him. It is black's turn to move, and he must save the king on his next move, or the game will be lost. There are three ways he may be able to save it. Move the king out of the way like this. As you can see, the queen cannot capture him now. Although in an actual game, a king cannot move onto a square where he would be in check. For this lesson, let us move the black king back into check and see if there's another escape route. Well, you could move another piece in front of the king like this. As you can see, the rook is now blocking the queen's attack line, so the king cannot be captured on the white queen's next move. The third way to escape is for the black army to capture the attacking piece. I'm sure you noticed that the black queen can capture the white queen along this diagonal here. Just before we leave the king, it is important to note that the two kings cannot be opposite each other like this during the course of the game, because both kings would be in check. Finally, we come to the foot soldiers of the army, the pawns. Each player has 8 pawns, and if you remember, they go along this rank here. Pawns can only move forward. They can move 2 squares forward on their first move, but only 1 square on each move after that. If one of your pawns reaches the other end of the board without being captured, you can exchange it for a queen or for any other piece except a king. It follows from this that you could have multiple pieces on the board at the same time. In this particular case, we have 2 white queens. If any piece obstructs the pawn like this, then the pawn will have to stop, because a pawn cannot capture a piece directly in front of it. To capture another piece, the pawn moves diagonally forward, either here or here. So if an enemy piece was on this square, the white pawn could capture it by moving diagonally, capturing the piece, and occupying the square. Before we leave the pawn moves, I would like to draw your attention to a special pawn move, which in the past has proven to be a little troublesome for absolute beginners. The special pawn move is called capturing en passant, which is French for in passing. This is a privilege accorded to a player who has a pawn on the 5th rank, as in this example. Such a pawn attacks 2 squares on the 6th rank and is allowed to capture any enemy pawn that passes across one of these squares without remaining there. If you remember, a pawn can move 2 squares forward on its first move. In this case, the white pawn may act as if the enemy pawn had moved only 1 square, and so may capture it en passant by moving to that square and removing the enemy pawn as if you would in a normal capture. Now, you may decide not to take advantage of this en passant capture, but if you do, you must make this capture immediately following the advance of the enemy pawn, or your chance will be lost. Now we come to the reason why all the chess pieces move around and one army battles with another. The aim of the game of chess is to trap the enemy king so he cannot escape being captured. The king is never actually captured and removed from the board like other chess pieces. The game is over when one side cannot avoid the loss of its king on the next move. If you look at this situation, you will see that the white king is being attacked by the black rook. Since the king can only move 1 square at a time in any direction, he cannot move to this square because the black bishop could capture him, and a king cannot move to a square where it could be captured. He cannot move to any of these squares because the black queen could capture him. Can white put a piece between the attacking rook and the king? No, he cannot. Finally, can white capture the black rook? No, he cannot. So the white king is attacked or checked by the black rook and cannot escape. When this happens, it is called checkmate, and the player with the checking piece, in this case black, wins the game. Now for a fairly difficult test. In this situation, can you find a move for black that checkmates white? In other words, can you move a black piece to attack the white king and leave him no escape route? To checkmate the white king, move the black rook along the file here to attack along this rank. The king cannot move to any of these squares because they are controlled by the black queen. The white army cannot put a piece between the rook and the king, and it cannot capture the checking piece or rook. So checkmate to black. In most games, before the king is checkmated, each side will try to weaken the other side's army by attempting to capture as many of that army's pieces as possible. Sometimes, you may have to lose one piece to gain another. You should only exchange pieces like this if your piece is of the same or less value than your opponent's piece. So you could lose a queen for a queen, or a rook for a rook. But other exchanges may not make sense. If we put a value of 1 on a pawn, the knight and bishop should be valued at 3, the rook 5, and the queen as the most powerful piece on the board 9. The king is not mentioned as he cannot be exchanged. Let us now look and see these values at work. The white rook can capture either the queen or the knight. If you were white, what piece would you take? The queen, yes, because the queen is worth 9 points, the knight only 3. Take a close look at this situation. You are black and have decided to exchange your black bishop for a white rook or bishop. You know that your black bishop will be captured in the exchange by the white queen or the white rook. But you have made the decision to exchange the pieces anyway. Which piece would you capture? The white rook, yes. Because the rook is worth 5 points, the bishop only 3. Now we come to a special manoeuvre called castling. This is a combined move for the rook and king. It helps keep the king safe and brings the rook to the centre of the board. You can castle on the queen side, known as queenside castling, or on the king side, known as kingside castling. To castle on the king side, move the king 2 squares towards the king's rook and move the rook to land next to the king here on his left side. Let us return the pieces to their original squares and look at castling on the queen side. This time you move the king 2 squares towards the queen's rook and then move the rook to land next to the king here on his right side. Again, let us return the pieces to their original squares and take a closer look at the rules for castling. You cannot castle if the king is in check. In other words, you cannot use the castling manoeuvre to escape a direct attack on your king. This rule does not state that just because the king was checked in the past, that he cannot castle in the future. This is a common belief that is simply untrue. The next rule states that it must be the king's and the rook's first move on the board. To castle correctly, there must not be any piece between the king and the rook. You cannot castle if the king will be in check on his new square after his 2 square move towards the rook. And finally, you cannot castle if the king passes over a square where it would be in check. Now for some questions on castling. On which side can the black king castle? Yes, on the king side, because the queen side is blocked by the knight. In this example, why can't the king castle on his king side? Because he would have to pass over a square which is attacked by the white queen. After all the struggle, it may not be possible for either side to checkmate, and the game ends in a draw. One type of draw occurs when one player cannot make any legal move but is not in check. If you look at this situation, you will see that the black king, whose turn it is to move, is not in check. But the enemy pieces are attacking all of these squares here and here. Since the king can only move 1 square in any direction and is not allowed to move onto a square where it could be captured, the game ends in a draw. This draw is called stalemate. If, on the other hand, black had any other piece he could move, for example a bishop, the game could continue. Drawn games can be agreed on at any time during the game. One player offers a draw, and if the other accepts, the game is over. This is the usual way a draw is agreed. Apart from a stalemate and an agreed draw, there are 3 other ways a draw could come about. The first of these is called perpetual check. If you look at this situation here and pay attention to the moves, you will see clearly what I mean. The white queen moves to the a6 square and checks the black king. The king moves to the b8 square. The queen moves to the b6 square and checks the king. The king moves to the c8 square. The queen moves to the c6 square. And the king is forced back to the square he started from. In theory, all these moves could be repeated again and again in a type of merry-go-round. But when both players recognise that they could be doing other things with their lives, an agreed draw usually follows. Failing this agreement, another rule states that if the identical position occurs 3 times in a game with the same player to move, as would happen in this position if the game continued, a draw may be claimed by either player. Another type of draw is called the 50-move rule. This is a very rare finish, but to complete chess for absolute beginners, let us take a quick look. The rule states that where both sides have made 50 consecutive moves without a pawn being played or a captured made, either side may claim a draw. That completes our first look at the game of chess. Chess for Absolute Beginners was produced for people who never played chess before, but would like to make that first move towards learning how to play one of the greatest board games in the world. If you have learned something from this guide and you know somebody who would like to start playing chess, please spread the word. Other Absolute Beginners guides will appear on this dedicated channel in future months. If you are interested, just subscribe. I am Dave Lee, signing off for Absolute Beginners Guides.